Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and as a Bible teacher, I'm really looking forward to today's session. We are going to be opening up the book of Job, specifically looking at the climax of the book. And to help me walk through this, I'm joined by our resident thoughtful believer who always brings such great, sincere questions to the table.
Thank you so much. It is genuinely good to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, I am really eager to get into this one because, well, whenever we talk about Job, the focus is almost always entirely on his suffering.
Right.
It's about the boils,
Mm-hmm.
the horrific loss of his children, and of course, those friends who give just terrible advice.
The notorious friends, yeah.
Exactly. But we kind of tend to skim over the ending. Or if we do actually read the ending, we usually just find it incredibly confusing.
Confusing is definitely the right word for it. I think for a lot of readers, for you listening right now, the end of Job probably feels like a massive left turn.
It really does.
Because you have 37 chapters of just agonizing, heart-wrenching questions. Job was sitting there scraping his sores with pieces of broken pottery, and he is asking God, why? What did I do? Just give me a trial so you can explain yourself.
And you really feel that tension building. You are right there with him, expecting a verdict. You expect God to finally show up and say, okay, Job, here is the specific legal reason for your pain, or at least hand him some sort of tidy theological formula to make it all make sense.
Yeah, but we don't get a formula. We get a whirlwind.
A literal whirlwind.
A literal whirlwind. And out of that storm, God does not give a philosophical lecture on the problem of evil. He actually gives Job a grand tour of creation.
Which is so unexpected.
It is. He talks about mountain goats giving birth. He talks about the ostrich of all things. He talks about weather patterns. And then right at the absolute crescendo of this speech, God spends 2 entire chapters describing 2 monstrous creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan.
And honestly, that is right where many of us just completely get lost. I mean, we read that and think, God, this man is literally dying inside. He has lost everything. And you were talking to him about a hippopotamus and a crocodile. It feels, I don't know, almost dismissive.
Yeah, it feels bizarre or like a deflection. But today we are exploring a really profound essay titled, What Do We Know About Leviathan and Behemoth Mentioned in Job?
Right.
And this essay argues that this is not a deflection at all. It is actually the answer.
Which is a huge claim to make.
It is a massive claim. These are not just random animal facts thrown in to distract a grieving man. These 2 creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, are actually the theological anchor for the entire book.
So the core thesis here is that understanding these 2 specific monsters is somehow the key to understanding how we are supposed to survive our own suffering.
That is exactly the core thesis. The text is teaching us that the strongest, most terrifying realities we fear are still just creatures, and their maker absolutely rules them. So the text is really an invitation to worship, rather than an invitation to speculate about why we suffer.
Okay, so that is our mission for this deep dive.
That is the mission. We are going to unpack this thoroughly. We are going to look at the historical background, the biblical narrative of these beasts, their theological significance, and finally, the practical application for your life today.
I am so ready for this. Where do we even begin to tackle a topic like this?
Well, we really have to start with the historical and cultural background. We have to sort of mentally travel back to the ancient world in which Job actually lived. The essay does a fantastic job setting the stage by reminding us of the extreme vulnerability of the ancient world.
And that is a really hard shift for us to make mentally, isn't
Oh,
it?
absolutely.
Because, I looked at the weather forecast on my phone this morning. If it rains, I have a solid roof. If the river starts to rise, we have levees and dams and emergency alerts.
We have largely engineered the danger out of our daily interaction with nature.
Right, we treat nature as a resource or maybe just a scenic backdrop for a vacation.
But in the ancient Near East, nature was a terrifying, deeply unpredictable force. There was no early warning system. If the river swelled up, it could wipe out your entire village, your entire livelihood in an hour.
Just total devastation without warning.
Exactly. If you walked through the marshlands, you were not bird watching. You were actively scanning for predators that could pull you under and kill you in seconds. Life operated completely beyond human control.
So when the Bible talks about nature to these ancient people, it is speaking to an audience who felt profoundly small and vulnerable.
Extremely small. And this is so crucial for understanding the wisdom teaching in Job. The pattern of biblical wisdom often reasons from the reality of nature directly to the character of the maker.
Can you give an example of that from the text?
Sure, you see it in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, or even earlier in Job in chapter 12, where Job himself says, ask the animals and they will teach you.
So the underlying idea is that if you look closely at the design of the world, you understand something vital about the designer.
Yes, but it goes even deeper than just noticing intelligent design. It is fundamentally about authority. The logic of the ancient believer was this moral order rests entirely on divine rule, not on human leverage.
Because humans had zero leverage over the elements.
Right. They knew they could not command the stars or hold back the sea. So if there is any order at all in the universe, it must be because a higher power is actively holding it together.
That makes total sense. But there's another layer to this ancient context, right? Because they didn't just see nature as physically dangerous, they actually saw it as mythological.
Yes, the essay brings up this very important concept of chaos monsters, and we really need to spend a moment here.
Please do, because I think this is where it gets really interesting for a lot of people.
In the cultures surrounding Israel, so we were talking about Babylon, Canaan, Egypt, they all had these massive epic creation myths. Scholars often use the German term Chaoskampf.
Chaos camp. Which means what, exactly?
It translates roughly to struggle against chaos.
Okay, so what did that struggle look like in their stories?
Well, take the Babylonian story, the Enuma Elish. In that myth, you have the storm god Marduk fighting the sea goddess Tiamat. And Tiamat is depicted as this horrific dragon or sea monster who represents chaos and the dark, salty ocean depths.
So it is a literal battle of the gods.
A violent, brutal battle. Marduk actually has to violently slaughter her, split her massive body in half, and then he uses her carcass to construct the heavens and the earth.
Wow, so in that worldview, creation itself is just the aftermath of a cosmic war.
It is a very precarious victory. The order of the world only exists because one god managed to beat up the monster. But the lingering fear is that the monster, or the chaos it represents, is always out there, threatening to return and unmake everything.
That sounds terrifying. And you see that in Canaanite mythology too, right? With Baal.
Exactly. You have the storm god Baal fighting Yam, who is the god of the sea. It is a constant, endless struggle for dominance and survival among the gods.
So my question is, does the Bible actually use this imagery? Because I know as I read the Psalms or Isaiah, I see names like Rahab and Leviathan pop up, and it sounds very similar to these myths.
The Bible absolutely borrows the cultural vocabulary. The biblical writers were well aware of these stories. But, and this is a massive theological distinction, the Bible completely subverts the meaning of those myths.
Subverts it how? How is it different under strict monotheism?
In those pagan myths, the gods are anxious. They're literally fighting for their lives. But in the Bible, God is never fighting for dominance. He is never out of breath. He is never worried about the outcome of a battle.
So when the Bible brings up a creature like Leviathan,
It is just that, a creature. It is not a rival god. Look at Psalm 104, for example. It says, "There is the sea, vast and spacious, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there."
frolic. That almost sounds like it is describing a pet.
That is exactly the point. To the surrounding nations, the sea monster was this ultimate god of chaos to be dreaded. But to Yahweh, it is basically a rubber ducky in his bathtub. It is a plaything.
That is amazing.
The essay emphasizes this heavily. God splits the sea and sets boundaries for the ocean, like we read in Psalm 74, Psalm 93, not because he had to violently battle it into submission, but simply because he spoke a word.
That is a total paradigm shift for how you view the universe. It takes the absolute scariest thing imaginable and says, to God, this is nothing.
Right. It completely demythologizes the universe while somehow making God's majesty even greater, and that really sets the stage for the era of Job himself.
The essay mentions that Job likely lived in the patriarchal era, right?
Yes, scholars generally agree Job lived before the law was given at Sinai, before Moses.
Why is that timeline detail so important for our deep dive today?
Because it means Job does not have a Bible. He does not have the Torah to flip through when he is suffering. There is no centralized sanctuary or priesthood for him to consult. In Job chapter 1, we see him acting as the priest for his own family, offering sacrifices.
So his entire relationship with God is mediated through direct address and through what he observes in providence.
Exactly. Nature and providence are the primary texts he has been reading his whole life. And the essay highlights this beautiful thread of hope here.
What is that thread?
Even before the law existed, the God who waters the desolate lands where no one lives, which is a phrase from Job 38, that God will not abandon the world to chaos. He brings history to a righteous end, just as Isaiah 55 says, his word will not return void.
Okay, so we have the historical and cultural stage fully set. Job is in agony. He feels the world is chaotic, unjust, and he desperately wants answers. And God's response is to take him down to the riverbank to look at the first beast. Behemoth.
Yes, this brings us to the biblical narrative section of the essay, starting with Job chapter 40. God says to Job, "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you."
I want to pause right there on that specific phrase,
Yeah.
made along with you. That seems incredibly intentional.
It is a pivotal phrase. Think about Job's posture leading up to this. He has been demanding a special, exclusive audience with the Almighty. He feels entirely singled out by his suffering, as if he is the center of the universe.
And God starts his response by pointing to a beast and saying, I made him exactly the same way I made you.
It completely levels the playing field. It is a stark reminder of shared creatureliness.
Because we usually put ourselves at the very top of the hierarchy, right beneath God.
We do. We think we are the undisputed center of God's attention and plans. But here, God groups Job, the righteous, suffering human, together with Behemoth under the category of things I made. It gently but firmly reminds Job that he is a tenant in God's house, not the landlord.
Wow. So what actually is this behemoth? I have heard people argue it is a hippo or an elephant or even some kind of dinosaur.
It is a famous debate. The Hebrew word behemoth is actually a plural form of the word for cattle or beast. It is what scholars call an intensive plural, meant to signify a super beast or the ultimate beast.
The beast to end all beasts.
Right. Historically, many commentators identify it with the hippopotamus, mainly because the text describes it living in the river, eating grass, and possessing immense physical strength.
What about the folks who say it is a dinosaur?
Well, they usually point to the verse that says its tail sways like a cedar. They argue a hippo's tail is tiny, so it must be something massive like a sauropod.
And where does the essay land on this debate?
Brother Brome points out that while it likely corresponds to a real observed creature like the hippo, the biblical description is highly poetic and elevated. It is a hippo plus, if you will.
So it is the animal viewed through the magnifying lens of divine majesty.
Exactly. But honestly, the specific zoological identification matters far less than the theological description. Let's walk through the imagery the text actually uses.
Okay, God points out its core strength first. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly.
And then it uses this incredibly strong language. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like rods of iron.
That sounds like industrial language. It describes it almost like a piece of heavy machinery.
It absolutely conveys a sense of indestructibility. But here is the massive paradox of Behemoth. With all those iron bones and bronze tubes, what does this monster eat?
Grass. It feeds on grass like an ox.
Exactly. It is not a predator. It is not hunting humans in the dark. It is a giant vegetarian. It is entirely peaceful, yet it possesses immense, unassailable power. It just rests under the lotus plants, hiding in the reeds of the marsh.
There's that one scene in the text that really stood out to me, the scene at the river.
Oh, it is a brilliant image. Read it for us.
It says, when the river rages, it is not alarmed. It is secure, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth.
Think back to the vulnerability we discussed earlier. To an ancient human, a raging, flooding river is an absolute crisis. It means panic, destruction, death.
But to Behemoth,
To Behemoth, it is just Tuesday. He does not even blink. He is so incredibly heavy, so deeply grounded and strong, that the sheer chaos of a rising river does not move him an inch.
and then God turns and asks Job a very pointed closing question about this beast.
He asks, can anyone capture it by the eyes? Or trap it and pierce its nose?
And the obvious answer is no. You cannot just walk up, put a ring in a super hippo's nose, and lead it around like a docile dairy cow.
So we have to ask, what is the actual implication here? Why is God showing a suffering man an uncatchable river beast?
Is it simply God flexing? Just saying, look how much stronger I am than you.
It is much more subtle and profound than that. The essay frames this under the heading of strength apart from utility. And I think this is a concept you listening really need to grasp.
Because we are incredibly utilitarian creatures, aren't we?
We are. We look at an animal or a forest or a river, and our very first thought is, what is this for? Can I eat it? Can I ride it? Can it pull my plow or generate electricity for me?
We define the inherent worth of something based entirely on how useful it is to our own projects.
Right, but Behemoth functions as a theology of strength completely apart from utility. Behemoth is entirely useless to human beings.
You cannot yoke it to a cart.
You cannot drive it, you cannot hire it to build a pyramid. It exists in the world purely for its own sake and for the sheer pleasure of God who created it.
That is a massive blow to human ego. It means God deliberately populates the world with immense powers that do not exist to serve us.
It completely decenters humanity. It shows us that God delights in variety, as Psalm 104 tells us, and he delights in creatures that we find totally unmanageable. We have to learn to honor strengths that we do not control.
So if Job cannot even manage to put a leash on a grass-eating river beast,
Then how in the world can he presume to manage the moral arc of the universe? It redirects the sufferer. It takes Job from this desperate desire for mastery and explanation and moves him into a humble posture of trust.
that is profound. But God is not done yet. He moves from the land to the deep ocean, from Behemoth to Leviathan in chapter 41.
Yes, and the temperature in the room changes drastically here. If Behemoth was the beast of the land, Leviathan is the undisputed monster of the sea.
And if Behemoth was just indifferent to us, Leviathan sounds actively hostile and terrifying.
Absolutely. God starts by listing the sheer failure of human tools against this creature.
It is almost comical how many weapons he lists. Hooks, cords, ropes, harpoons, spearheads.
And none of them penetrate the armor. The text says that to Leviathan, iron is just like straw and bronze is like rotten wood. Arrows do not make him flee. He literally laughs at the rattling of the lance.
Total military failure. But the essay also highlights something I never noticed before, the commercial language used here.
Oh, yes, the failure of commerce.
Yeah.
God asks Job, will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Will it make an agreement with you to be your slave for life?
It is mocking the very idea of monetizing the monster.
Exactly. Think about human history. We catch massive tuna to stuff into little cans. We capture killer whales and put them in glass tanks to sell tickets. We instinctively try to turn nature into a commodity.
And God is essentially asking, are you going to draft a contract with Leviathan? Are you going to hire him?
It is a ridiculous image. You cannot buy him and you cannot hire him. And then God delivers this chilling warning. Lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again.
That is not a philosophical argument. That is a visceral, deeply humbling reality check.
It teaches humility in a way that intellectual debates rarely do. The memory of trying to fight something that far outclasses you stays in your bones forever.
But right in the middle of this terrifying description, there is a shift. The essay refers to this as the pivot line of the whole discourse.
Yes, Job 41, verses 10 and 11. If you are taking notes on this deep dive, you need to circle these verses. This is the thunderous logic of God.
What does he say?
God says, no one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me?
Okay, help us trace the logic there. How does that shift the argument?
It is a classic argument from the lesser to the greater. God is saying, look, Job, you are absolutely paralyzed with fear at the mere thought of this creature. You wouldn't dare wake Leviathan up from a nap. You would run for your life.
Right.
Well, I am the one who made it. I am the one who commands it. So if you do not have the courage to stand in front of my creature, what on earth makes you think you have the standing to haul me into a courtroom and demand answers?
Wow, that completely shifts the awe. If the creation is that scary, how much more terrifying and majestic is the creator?
Exactly. And he follows it right up in verse 11 by saying, who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me.
Which is a direct strike against Job's entire lawsuit, isn't it? Because Job has been operating under the assumption that his righteousness meant God owed him a good life.
God refuses that premise entirely. God owes no repayment. He says, I own everything. The language of ownership here is key. Now, he does bind himself to us by his promises, but he is not a debtor to anyone. He owes us nothing.
It is an invitation for Job to just rest his case, to stop demanding a payout and trust the character of the absolute judge.
Right. And after establishing that absolute sovereignty, God goes back into describing the sheer terror of Leviathan, and it gets almost supernatural.
Yeah, it talks about this double coat of scales that is sealed so tight that air cannot even pass between them.
It is an engineering marvel. Pure, impenetrable armor. His chest is hard as a lower millstone.
And a millstone is what they used to grind grain, right?
Yeah.
So it is the hardest, heaviest rock in the ancient village.
Meaning Leviathan has no soft spot, physically or metaphorically. You cannot appeal to his pity. And then there is the imagery of his breath. It says his sneezes flashlight, smoke pours from his nostrils, his breath sets coals ablaze.
Is the text talking about a literal fire-breathing dragon there?
Most scholars read this as highly poetic imagery describing a massive crocodile surfacing. You know, when it aggressively exhales water spray into the bright sunlight, it looks like steam or flashing fire.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it leaves a wake behind it in the water that looks like white hair on the deep. But the ultimate verdict on this beast is found at the very end of chapter 41. God says, nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud.
King over the proud. That feels like a very targeted message.
It is the ultimate diagnostic. Leviathan functions here as a living parable of untamable pride. He represents every heart that refuses to wear a yoke, every power that refuses to submit to God.
So we have Behemoth teaching us about strength apart from utility, and Leviathan teaching us about untamable pride. But I have to ask the obvious question, the one the essay wrestles with. How does any of this actually help Job's pain?
It is the crucial question, isn't it?
Because if someone I love is suffering deeply, sitting in ashes, and I walk up and start reading them an encyclopedia entry about a crocodile's scales, they're going to think I am completely insane.
They would, and rightly so, because you are not God. But why does it work for God to do it?
Yeah, that is what I'm trying to grasp.
It works because Job was not just grieving. If he was only crying in pain, God would have just comforted him. But Job was actively accusing God of injustice. He was trying to deconstruct the moral universe to justify himself.
He was putting the Creator on trial.
Exactly. So this vision of the monsters places Job's personal pain within a universe that God founded and that God governs. A universe that is vastly bigger, wilder, and more complex than Job's neat little theological formulas.
The essay calls this the creator-creature distinction, right?
Yes, and that distinction stands at the very center of the book's theological significance. When Job finally sees the gap between himself and God, when he sees that God is effortlessly managing chaotic powers that Job cannot even look at, it breaks him.
But it doesn't break him in a bad way.
No, it breaks the spell of his own pride. Job repents in dust and ashes in chapter 42. He says, "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know."
And the essay points out something profound here. It brings relief. Recognizing that we are just creatures actually frees the soul.
It is a massive relief because if you are just a creature, you are completely freed from the crushing, impossible burden of trying to control everything. You don't have to manage the deep.
You don't have to have the answer to every tragedy to know that the Maker is still on the throne.
Precisely. Job never gets the backstage explanation about Satan and the cosmic wager. He does not get his specific answers. He gets something far better. He gets God's presence.
Meeting the Lord gave more light than answers ever could.
God is not on trial here. He is gently but firmly teaching a beloved sufferer to stop analyzing and start living by worship.
I want to circle back to Leviathan as the symbol of pride for a second. The essay mentions an eschatological hope tied to this imagery.
That is a vital point. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, right? James 4.6. Well, Leviathan is the king of the proud. He embodies all the chaotic, rebellious, evil powers in the world.
And right now, God is letting Leviathan swim.
Yes, for a time, God allows the chaos. But Isaiah 27.1 gives us a prophetic promise using this exact imagery. It says, "In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword. Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea."
So this isn't just an ancient nature lesson. It is a promise about the end of the world.
The fact that God easily handles Leviathan now is our absolute guarantee that he will finally judge and destroy those proud powers in the end. Humility is really the only sane path for us.
Which leads perfectly into the Christological connection the essay makes. Because nature acts as an instructor, what we call general revelation, but it points to something, or someone specific.
It absolutely does. You cannot read Job 41 as a Christian and not immediately think of the New Testament.
Specifically the Gospel of Mark, right?
Yes, Mark chapter 4. Think about the disciples. They are in a small boat on the Sea of Galilee. The sea represents the abyss, the chaos. Suddenly, a furious squall comes up, a leviathan of a storm.
And they are terrified. They think they're going to drown.
They are completely vulnerable, but Jesus is in the stern sleeping on a cushion.
Just like God is entirely unanxious about Leviathan and Job.
Exactly the same unthreatened posture. The disciples wake him up in a panic. Jesus stands up, rebukes the wind, and says to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And instantly, it is completely calm.
And the disciples are even more terrified then. And they ask a very specific question.
They ask, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him.
And if they had really understood Job 38 through 41,
they would know exactly who was in the boat with them. The one who effortlessly stills the waves is the voice from the whirlwind. The maker who sets bars and doors for the sea is the same Savior sleeping in their boat.
That is just incredible. The essay mentions the progress of revelation here, from providence to the law to the Spirit.
Right, there are distinct stages of how God reveals himself, but it is one unified Savior. The God who commands the monsters in Job is the shepherd of Psalm 23, who leads us beside still waters.
Okay, I want to transition us into the spiritual lessons and practical application section, because, to be fair, you and I are probably never going to literally wrestle a crocodile.
Probably not today, no.
But we all face Leviathans in our own lives, don't we?
We absolutely do. Every one of us has realities in our lives that are unmanageable, untamable, and frankly, terrifying.
So we are talking about a devastating medical diagnosis, or a sudden financial collapse, or maybe a child who is deeply rebelling.
Yes, those are the chaotic deeps we face. And our immediate fleshly temptation is always to do exactly what Job tried to do. We try to assert control, or we start accusing God of managing the universe poorly.
So what is the practical alternative? How do we apply this?
The essay starts by contrasting reverence and anxiety. When we are consumed by anxiety, what are we usually looking at?
We are usually staring directly at the monster.
Right. We are staring at the diagnosis, looking at the bank account, fixating on the terrifying scales and teeth of our problem. And the longer you stare at the Leviathan, the smaller you feel, and the more panicked your heart gets.
So the application is to shift our gaze.
Exactly. Reverence steadies the heart. True prayer does not begin with an assessment of how big the problem is or how strong we feel. Prayer begins with who God is.
If you start prayer by saying, God, this cancer is huge, you just magnify the fear.
But if you start by saying, Maker of heaven and earth, you hold all things together, and this terrifying situation is entirely subject to your word that completely reorients your reality. The Creator is completely unthreatened by what terrifies you.
That is a very practical daily shift in how we pray. What about the point the essay makes about domesticating danger?
This is a profound warning, especially when it comes to sin. Remember God mocking the idea of putting Leviathan on a leash for your young women to play with?
Yeah, treating the monster like a pet.
It is absolute folly, but we
Yeah.
do this with destructive powers and sin all the time. We think, well, I can handle a little bit of this temptation. I can just sort of manage this secret habit. I can keep this resentment or bitterness as a pet, and it won't hurt me.
We try to negotiate with it.
And wisdom screams at us from this text. You cannot negotiate with a monster. It will eventually consume you. People try to bargain with destructive powers instead of fleeing them.
So true wisdom is choosing distance.
Repentance and distance. Integrity actually grows in the place where our bargains with sin finally end. You do not domesticate Leviathan. You stay far away from him.
That is sobering. I also loved the point about gratitude in hard seasons, which ties back to Behemoth.
Yes, think back to the river scene. Behemoth is resting calmly while the river swells up to his mouth. Why is he calm? Because he is perfectly fitted for his environment.
He was built to handle that specific rising water.
The practical comfort for you listening is this. God equips his children for the specific trials they did not choose. You might look ahead at a potential crisis and think, I absolutely cannot handle that.
And in our own strength, we really can't.
But God gives the strength exactly when the river rises. He provides for the exact environment he places you in, and practice here is naming our mercies.
Like Lamentations 3 says, his compassions never fail. They are new every morning.
Yes, actively naming the mercies God provides in the middle of the flood keeps your heart from hardening into bitterness. It acknowledges that even in the chaotic water, God has provided stability.
There is also an application here regarding how we speak about God, especially to others who are suffering.
This is a huge rebuke to Job's friends. We need to be so careful here. Job's friends had a lot of orthodox theology, but they weaponized it. They had accuracy without tenderness.
And accuracy without tenderness wounds people.
It crushes them. But on the flip side, tenderness without accuracy just misleads them. Counsel has to agree with both God's holy character and his patient pace. When someone is in the ashes, we do not need to explain the mystery of their Leviathan to them. We need to sit with them and point them to the Maker.
Finally, the essay talks about stewardship versus control.
It comes back to that pivotal verse, everything under heaven belongs to me. If God truly owns everything, then we are merely stewards.
We don't own our power, our money, or our skills.
We treat them as trusts given to us by the Master, not as levers we pull to guarantee our own safety. A community shaped by this truth will admire strength, but they will never idolize it because they know salvation belongs entirely to the Lord.
This really has been a deep dive. To try and summarize all of this, these two bizarre chapters at the end of Job are really designed to break the spell of our own self-rule, aren't they?
They are a severe mercy. They call us back to absolute sanity.
Because we are creatures. We are not the managers of the deep. Yeah. God is the judge, not the defendant in our personal courtroom.
And the beautiful result of accepting that is a completely different way of life. Humility replaces accusation. Deep trust replaces our frantic techniques for control.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to return to the scripture that anchors this whole essay.
Yes, I am going to read Job 41, verses 10 and 11 one more time. And as you listen, do not hear this as a threat designed to crush you. Hear it as a majestic reminder of the vast, unshakable capability of your Father.
Amen.
The text says, "No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me."
That is the ultimate encouragement. If he holds the terrifying Leviathan on a leash, he certainly holds you in his hand.
Absolutely. He rules the storm and he calls you his own. So receive this blessing as we close today. May you find true rest in the unyielding strength of the Maker who owns everything under heaven. May you walk in the profound peace of knowing that the one who commands the monsters is the same one who loves you. Go today in his grace and his power.